In this tutorial, what we're going to do is set up a file that will give us a nice visual representation for understanding how a displace filter modifies a graphic using a displacement map. So to start off, we're going to start with a fresh new Photoshop document. So just launch Photoshop, and when you launch Photoshop, you can click the New button. And from the dialog box, I'm just going to call this Displace 01. And then I want to set the width to 600 pixels, the height to 600 pixels, resolution to 300, and color mode RGB, 8-bit graphic, white background, and color profile sRGB. And once you have that set up, you can click OK. And what this will give us is our regular blank canvas to work on. So to start, what we're going to do is use the ellipse tool to create a circle in the middle of our graphic. So you want to pick a fill color for that, just so they have it for now. And then what you can do is shift, click, and drag, and then using your spacebar temporarily help you reposition the graphic towards the center. So you can use your smart guides for that, but if you weren't using your smart guides for that, you can do Command A to select the whole canvas, and then if you grab your selection tool, that will give you your alignment and arrangement commands. So we could do center and center to center our graphic that way as well. And then you hit Command D to deselect the canvas. Okay, so now we have our circle in the middle of the frame, but this color is not going to be needed right now because we're going to add a gradient overlay to this. So what I want you to do is come up to the fill and take the fill down to 0. And that will get rid of the fill on our circle, so it will disappear, but the ellipse layer is still there. Then hit the Enter key to commit to that fill change. And then if you double click on the ellipse layer in the gray area of the layer, that will open up your layers panel. And then in the layer panel, or layer style panel, you have the different types of effects and layer styles. So what we're going to do is click this dark gray area of the gradient overlay layer style. So I'm doing that because if I just click the checkbox, it will apply a gradient, but it will then not give me the layer style panel for a gradient overlay. By clicking the actual bar, it gives me the options panel for that particular layer style. So then you can see I already have the gradient laid out that we did in lecture, but I'm going to walk through the process of creating it anyway because I want you guys to see how I did that. So for opacity of the gradient, I leave it 100%. Then when I'm choosing a gradient type, I use the pull down menu, and I'm using the black to white gradient, so I'm going to click on that to reset it. You will have black to white here if your default colors are black and white, and then this one looks black to white when you see it on screen, but notice it is actually your foreground color to 0 transparency, so it's a little different. So use a black to white gradient. And then with the black to white gradient, from the style menu, it usually is defaulted to linear, so you would choose radial, and then radial gradient will get you this soft gradient. And then you can see when I just move this panel away, I have black on the left side of my gradient ramp, and then white on the right, so black is the center, white is the outside. So I could use the reverse button to reverse that, so we can do that if you want, but it doesn't really matter where you start. Okay, but let's say I wanted to modify the color stops of this gradient ramp. So what I do is I just click this gradient ramp area inside the box, not the drop-down menu, but the gradient ramp itself, and click on it, and it opens up the gradient editor. So now I get all of my preset gradients that I can save for gradient swatches and that sort of thing. And I'm not going to talk about all of this because this is more digital imaging stuff. But using the gradient ramp, very similar to Illustrator. So when you hover beneath the gradient ramp, you could add multiple color stops to your gradient. So I'm going to add 3 stops about throughout my gradient ramp here so that I have 5 stops total. And then on the outside stops of the gradient, what you can do is if you double click on a color stop, you get your color picker. So from the color picker, you can adjust the values and information for the colors. So in this case, since we're creating a displacement map, what I want you to do is work in gray values for the information that you're going to be using. So what I did is reset my panel, so I'm back to my hue and everything. But for this case, what I can use is my brightness setting. As long as I'm set to either white or black, if I modify the brightness, it's just going to move the slider up and down the ramp. And I want to do this numerically because a displacement map, as you guys remember from lecture, is based off of your gray values and black and white point. So For this particular stop, I'm going to do it at 50%. So I get perfect 128, which is your middle gray. And then I'm going to press OK for that gradient stop. Now, this gradient stop, it really doesn't matter what you do. So I'm going to maybe do this a little differently than I did in lecture. But if I double click on this one, I can make this one white. So I can, I'm not set at white because I have my red. So I'm going to come back down here and set that stop to white. And then to my center one, I'm going to set this to black, so I can bring that down, and then press OK. And then I'm going to come and double click on this one and bring it to white, or 100%, with no color values, of course, and RGB. And then this one I'm going to bring to gray. So I can go to 50 on this one, and then press OK. Okay, so now you can see I have pretty much that similar gradient that I created earlier. And then once you're done editing the gradient ramp, you can press OK. That brings you back to the layer style panel, and then you just want to move that into view, and then you can press OK there. Okay, so now what I have here is an ellipse with concentric, values on this as a gradient. So just to review, a displacement map, which we're going to create from this file, is a map that determines a level of shift of pixels that lay on top of it. So if I were to lay a graphic on top of this as a displacement map, any value that is gray is left untouched, meaning that no matter what values I set in my displacement filter, the pixels on top of this layer will not be moved up or down or left to right. Any pixels that are white, or overlaying a white part of a gradient map, will be manipulated in a positive relationship. So if it was vertical positive, it would go up, and if it was horizontal positive, it would go to the right. Any black pixels on a gradient map will move a pixel above it in a negative direction. So if it was a vertical, it would move it down, and if it was horizontal, it would move it to the left. Okay? So positive up and to the right, negative down and to the left. And then gray, no change at all. So if we lay a graphic over this, and as a displacement map, nothing will happen to the gray values. I'll get a slow curve upward to the white, and then a slow curve downward to the black, or actually a sharper curve to the black because I'm going past middle gray and all the way down to black. And then a sharp curve up to the white, and then a soft curve flattening back out at the gray, and then continuing on across that map. So let's do that. Let's save that as a map. So what I first want to do is save this as my layered file. This file I'm going to come back to later. Okay, so I'm going to do a Command-Shift-S, and then I'm going to save this as Displace01, and then I'm going to do _layers. So I know this is my file with the layers in it, and I'm going to find a location. So let's see, I have a folder on my desktop for this. Put in my displacements tutorial video folder, and you can find a location for it, or you can create a new location for it. And so now I have that layered file. Now you can go up to the image, and let's see, image duplicate function. So if I go to image duplicate, gives me the ability to label that file. So what I'm going to do is take off copy in layers and call it flattened, and then press OK. And then that gives me a new tab of the same document. Notice nothing has changed. If I just zoom out to the screen, Command-0, if I go back and forth, they're identical. But it gave me the ability to rename the file and open up a new document. And that's a good practice to use when you're going to be flattening a file, because that's what we're going to be doing with our map file here. So what I'm going to do is go to the panel menu and do Flatten Image. And then I'm going to do another Command-Shift-S, and then I'm going to call this my map, okay? And then I'm going to save that in that displacement maps folder that I initially used, okay? And save it as a PSD, make sure that the color profile is embedded, and press it. Okay, so what I have here now is I've created a displacement map out of my layered file, okay? So, and I have that distinction in the file names because with a displace filter, you're going to use the map as a reference when applying the displace filter effect. Okay, so technically I can close this file because I'm just going to access it through the Displace Filter dialog box, but we can leave it open in case you wanted to make any adjustments to my map because it may or may not be working on the actual working file that I'm using. So just to talk about the principle that we did here, I used my base image to create my displacement map. Okay, that's one method I can do to create a displacement map. But in this case, I created my base content. So you can see I can make a displacement map out of anything with gray, white, and black values. So I could use my brush tool, I could use my linear gradient, and I can basically create any texture, any undulation of space by painting or using gradients with my brush tool and all the custom brushes I have and all of those interesting nuances. So I can create textures, I can create all different types of stuff without ever having to bring in a photo for a displacement map. But we're going to cover in the further tutorials how to use a photo to do so. Okay, so now what we need to do in my displace one layers file is I want to create something to displace with that new displacement map that we just created. So I'm going to do a new layer, so Command-Shift-N, and I'm going to call it stripes. Okay, so on my stripes layer, I'm selecting my color as red in the color picker, and then I'm going to grab my rectangle marquee. And using my document bounds, actually, for snapping, you could just make sure your snapping's turned on, Shift Command semicolon, because this will allow your marquee to snap to the edge. So I'm going to make stripes across my document. So I make one rectangle, edit, fill, foreground color. Okay. So once I have one of my stripes, I can use my selection tool, sorry, not my marquee tool, and then do my option key to duplicate that rectangle. And then I'm going to hold down my shift key because my shift key is going to snap it in center to the document so I don't have to drag all carefully. So notice how it keeps it to the document bounds and it's not shifting left or right. And then I'm just going to span it out so there's about an equal space relative to the size of my rectangle, and then release that. And then what I could do to speed up the process is grab my magic wand tool. And when I grab my magic wand tool, I can select the other rectangle that I just deselected because remember, magic wand tool is color-based. Of course, you want to make sure your tolerance is okay, but in this case, since it's a solid red, even if your tolerance is 1, it would still work. And then once I select those, I can go back to select to my move tool, and then I can do my shift option and click, and now I have 2 bars. And then I can do that again with the 4 because that will help me complete the rest of this graphic. So grab my magic wand tool, select these 2 to add them to the selection, then go back to my move tool and then do shift, option, click, and drag, and then I get the rest of the stripes that are going to pass over my shape because I don't necessarily have to add more stripes down here because they're not going to be displaced. Only the stripes are going to be displaced here, but I did want to leave a few that were off the shape so we can see what happens there. Okay, so once I get all of those shapes there, I'm going to deselect those final 4 rectangles, and now I have my stripes layer on its own layer. So I have my ellipse with my gradient, I have my background white, and then I have my stripes. So now with the stripes, before you work with a displacement filter or a displace filter, we have smart filters with smart objects, and that is very helpful for displacement maps among other filters because by converting my stripes layer, by right-clicking on it, to smart object, now when I go up to the filter menu and use the distort displace filter, it will become a smart filter in my layer panel. And that's really nice because then if I want to make any changes or modifications to my displacement, all I have to do is double click on the filter and then it will open up the dialog box again. So let's do that. Filter, distort, displace, and this will launch the displace dialog box. So like we discussed in lecture, horizontal scale moves the graphics horizontally. So in this case, my graphic is horizontal in nature. So my horizontal values are not going to do much once we create a mask to mask out my circle because it's going to move these bars left and right, but we won't see that movement. Vertical scale, however, on this displacement map, because I can visually see my map because it's the same as my content, it will move these lines significantly either up or down or keep them static where the 128 values are. So I'm going to set my horizontal to 0 because we know that won't make too much of a modification. And then I'm going to keep my vertical at 10. Okay? And then when I click OK, this opens a finder box. And now you're meant to choose your displacement map that you created earlier. So I'm just going to go to my desktop because I think that was located at a wrong map there. And I'm going to go to my video tutorials, my displacement map folder, and there I have my displacement flattened map layer. So I select that, wherever you had saved it, it's probably a different location for you, and then I press open. Okay, so now you can see what happens here. When I pressed open, it laid that displacement map over the filter, the smart filter, on the stripes layer, and then what you can see is the gray values remained in place. And it doesn't look that way because these lines are off-centered from it, but that's because they're on white. And remember, white shifts upward, gray doesn't move, and then all values of gray leading to white slowly shift upward, and then all values leading to black shift down to middle gray, that's no movement, but then we go beyond middle gray to black and it shifts it down 10% below gray, then we go back up to white, 10% above gray, and then we resolve back at gray with no movement. So you can see this if I turn my smart filter, the displace filter, on and off. So if I turn it on and off, you can see the places that don't move, and then you can see the white and black values that move up and down relative to the displaced percentage. And if you hear my cat meowing in the background, we'll just have to roll with that because I'm too far into the tutorial to make him stop. He's just saying hi. Okay, so now that we have that, one of the really beautiful things of displacement maps is your blending modes. So if I select my stripes layer and I go up to my blending mode panel and choose multiply, you can see how that wraps that line around the graphic very nicely. It gives me the highlights of the shape where the stripe was going over the edge, and then it gives me shadows where the shape recedes into the graphic. Okay, so now our next step is to create a layer mask from this displacement map. Now, this particular file setup is designed for demonstrating displacement maps, so it's very easy to create a mask. All we simply do is command click on the thumbnail icon of our ellipse layer. So if you command click on any layer that has edges, it will select the boundary of it with your quick selection or with your marching ants. So this, I use the perfect ellipse, so it gives me a perfect circular selection. And my stripes layer is already selected. As long as you didn't accidentally click off of it, make sure your stripes layer is selected. And then I do add new layer mask. And when I click on that, it creates a perfect elliptical layer mask. And then I have my shape with the displacement map on it. And you don't see the white background of the line shifting up and down, or in this case just up because my displacement map had a white background. And you can see that if I go to my displace flatten map file, and look at that, white here, gray there, white here, gray, black, gray, white, gray. Okay, so then you can see the displacement. So let's mess with the displacement a little bit to see what happens. What I recommend when you're getting new to displacement maps or this file that you're going to be using is swing the handles really far. So if I double click on my displace filter, it will bring open the displace dialog box again. So let's see what happens when I bring my vertical scale up to like 80%. Because remember, vertical scale is relative to the gray values of the displace map. So the scales work in 100% increments. So it's 100% equals 128 luminance values, because that's middle gray and that's how far we are from black and white. So if I go to 100%, it's going to move that graphic 128 pixels either up or down or left or right based on whether I have horizontal scale activated or vertical scale. In this case, vertical scale is going to be the only one that visibly makes a change. So let's do 80 and then press OK, and then we have to re-choose that map again. It asks you to redefine the map because the map is not linked to the displace filter. It is a reference for the filter to use as a base. Okay? Then I press open. Now when I do 80, you see what happens. It starts repeating the layers because there is so much displacement that it breaks up the stripes into parts, and it breaks up the stripes and puts holes in the middle of them. So if you overdo the displacement map, it breaks up the shape really bad. But in a graphic standpoint, this could create really unique and awesome effects. So if you're doing water, if you're doing anything with a rippled shape, you would get these attributes in reflections and things like that. So it could work really well to your advantage, even though in this case it seems like I'm getting heavy-handed on the slider. So you can see how that happens. But let's go back to the displace filter and let's do something a little bit more softer. So we did 10 before, let's do 20 and just move it up 10% and press OK. Select the filter or displacement map and then press OK. Now you see when I do 20, it starts to add a little bit interesting effect. So now we have this stripe gets pulled up to the gray and this one gets pulled down. So by experimenting with your different displacements, you can significantly alter either the dimension of the content or the waviness or depth of the content you're displacing. So the displace filter affects how we perceive our base layer and how we perceive the three-dimensionality of the shape that's being displaced upon it. So let's go to the other round of displace filter. So we've been talking about positive values, but let's say I had a white value that I wanted to move downward. So white values only move upward by default using a positive percentage. Well, in the displace filter, you can use negative percentages. So I can go 128 in the different direction. So all the areas that are white are now going 20% upward. What if I did negative 20%? Then I can invert the direction my white values go. So I do negative 20 and press OK, apply my displace map and press open. Now it moves, and notice it basically changed somewhat the direction and feel of the way the shape wrapped around the graphic. So it gives a different perspective on the displaced layer. So before, my perspective was looking up because everything was being stretched upward, and now it would be as if I'm above my displaced layer and it's being stretched downward. So you can create a lot of optical dimension to your displaced layer by changing either negative and positive values, but also negative and positive values help you wrap graphics using displacement map around base layers that have lines and graphics going in multiple different ways. Because remember, in this particular map, all I have is vertical pixels. So I only have to worry about one line of my displace filter. But if I had graphics going both vertical and horizontal, like we do in regular bitmap graphics, there's pixels everywhere, we then have to manage our displace values a little bit more lightly, delicately, and pay attention to the adjustments and shifts they're making, because if we distort a graphic too much, if it's someone's nose or if it's a part of a texture that wouldn't be stretched and squashed, we have to be careful of that and modify our values. Okay? So this is a way to basically view a displace map to get a good idea of how it's working, how values interact with the displaced layers and vice versa. So if you have any questions about that, just shoot me an email, and that's that.